I am a senior research associate at Cambridge University, and I also am deputy director of the Reproductive Sociology Research Group there. I'm an anthropologist by training, but I do a lot of interdisciplinary work. And my main interest is in intersections between mental concerns and activism, and from a multi-species perspective. So, for example, at the moment, I'm doing some research on seed saving and seed activism here in London. Previously, I've looked at how environmentalists think about reproductive ethics and reproductive technologies. So I'm really interested in kind of the way that people talk about and think about reproduction in the broadest sense of the term, and environment, and how those intersect. Would you like to introduce yourself, Heather?
Sure, yeah. So I am an assistant professor of culture and media at Eugene Lang College at the New School in New York. I guess my main areas of focus have been on sort of questions, I would say, sort of thinking through the relationships between settler colonialism and environmentalism. So really thinking about, in my case, thinking through particular materialities. So I just finished a book about plastic, and the kind of implications that that has, which certainly connects up to questions of reproductive justice, but also broader, in a kind of broader way, to think about the relationships of contemporary art, and how artistic practices might be used as kind of testing grounds, or as places of provocation for thinking differently about how we might understand our relationships more broadly to the other than human world. And then I've also been involved in some of the Anthropocene debates. So yeah, main things.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested to talk more about your work on plastics, and your idea of plastics as toxic progeny, which I think is really interesting in itself, but it obviously relates to my own research and thinking about reproduction. And I really like how that idea kind of complicates this rhetoric that we often hear about future generations when people think about environment and activism around that. And I wonder if you could just sort of say a bit about that, and your, maybe how you got interested in that in the first place as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, I kind of got interested in it sort of in a way by accident. My partner at the time sent me this kind of incredible news article that was a picture of this fisherman holding this cod that had ingested a dildo. And so it just was like such a vivid image that I and you know, he discovered this by gutting the cod as one does, and finding this dildo inside, which is obviously very surprising. And so I started thinking about this, but I've been having lots of conversations before that also with the artist Pinar Yoldash, who has done this really brilliant piece called The Ecosystem of Excess, which she did in 2013. And in that, she imagines what would be kind of the life forms that would be necessary to survive, to either be able to metabolize or to like sort of successfully kind of sift out all the toxins from plastics. So she sort of thought about like, well, you know, if life starts in the oceans and now the oceans have these huge amounts of plastic in them, what would it mean for life to kind of evolve in a way now? And the interesting thing about that question is that even though, you know, in her project, it was speculative, she created all these different kinds of organisms and all these different organs that that really do have a kind of basis in scientific anatomy. The question isn't actually just speculative, right? So because this is precisely what's happening, right, both on the land and in the ocean, is that all of these bacteria, primarily bacteria and different forms of mycelium, are able now to digest plastics. And so I started thinking about, like, well, what does it mean? What is our kind of what is our ethical responsibility then towards these kinds of organisms, because they wouldn't exist. You know, we're pushing evolution in these very specific types of directions because of these widespread industries, these widespread petrochemical industries. And so what would it mean then to actually embrace these things, not just as a kind of interesting side fact, but actually as central to thinking about what it means to make kin, or what it means to have a kind of ongoing responsibility to something in the way that that we do to our relatives, you know, even if we don't get along, or even if we don't particularly like them. You know, there's like it's like that there's still this kind of ongoing responsibility or care towards them that's like sort of built into the ways in which we think about the world. And so sort of thinking through that in relationship to queer theory, which is obviously never really assumed that those kinds of biological families are safe or supportive places in the first place. And a lot of I draw a lot of inspiration from queer theory's intersection with environmentalism, because I think that there is a really much more capacious understanding of who you are in kinship with and who you are responsible for and towards, because that kind of normative family unit has never been assumed to be something that people would aspire towards or that people could attain. And so because of that, I think that there's a lot more room for thinking about our kind of mutual entanglements and also our obligations towards these kinds of new evolutionary beings. And then for me, that just kind of brings up these kinds of ethical questions of you know, if we were to take that as a kind of basis that that we did create these things and therefore we are bound to them in these particular types of ways, that both it kind of gets beyond what you're talking about in terms of the sort of figure of the child, which isn't to say that I don't want the world to be better for future generations, right? I think that's something we all want. But sometimes there's such a focus on one's own individual child, right? Or specific kind of figures of children that actually have no correspondence to real, actual living children. But it's really this kind of fixation on a particular type of child, this, like, you know, white, able-bodied, cisgendered child that is then going to kind of like continue on life as we now currently know it, instead of like sort of really thinking about and the kind of fixation that people often have in relationship to wanting their child to be the best at all costs, right? Not really taking into consideration the ways in which that might be, those structures might be harmful for many other children. So kind of trying to simultaneously sort of explode or complicate some of those relationships. Yeah, do you want to say more about how you think about reproductive justice in relationship to environmental justice?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that is a big ongoing question, and I think sort of working out how to kind of sit with these different justice movements and frameworks is a really important part of what I'm thinking about. And for me, environmental reproductive justice is a really helpful framework as well. Although I also constantly have this dilemma and in terms of drawing on these frameworks which have been developed in different locations and contexts, and myself, my own positionality as a white middle class British person, and how to, you know, use those frameworks, but in a way that isn't sort of appropriating or, unintentionally harmful. But it's really making me think about some research that I've done recently on groups like Birth Strike and Conceivable Future, which are climate activists who are pledging not to have children or not to have more children because they're concerned about the existential threats of climate change. And it's such an interesting example because it raises all these questions about, whose reproduction is valued and privileged, and why should this even be of interest to other people, at the same time as the leaders of these groups are also, they see themselves as being inspired by reproductive justice because they're, one of the elements of reproductive justice is about being able to raise children in healthy environments. So it sort of raises all these really kind of sticky problems and questions about the nature of reproductive decision making, but also who is able to kind of speak about and who gets listened to. But also, like you were saying about the individual children and then the figure of the child and all those children in between, that it raises all these kind of scalar questions which are really interesting because so for example, the person who set up Birth Strike here in the UK, her intention really was to raise the alarm, as she'd put it, about the very real existential threats of climate change. And she felt that talking about reproductive decision making would be quite a sort of media savvy way of getting that conversation to people who weren't already kind of engaging with those existential threats, as well as also genuinely feeling, this is an issue for her personally. But then, of course, when that conversation went out into the world, it's taken up in very different ways. So there's people who are saying, well, okay, why should we care? And then there's also people saying this is really problematic because you're not, paying attention to the ways in which people's reproductive kind of so-called choices have been curtailed in the past and the present. And then they were also painted as misanthropic, anti-natalist, populationist, which was really not the intention either, although of course there were some people who, put pledges on the internet saying, more kind of populationist things. So I think, it points to just what a sort of fascinating area it is because it gathers together all these different kinds of themes. And I think it's really interesting that you raise excess and waste and in questions of value as well, because that seems to be a kind of thread as well. I've written a bit about how environmentalists worry about how stuff gets left behind for future generations and how it sort of builds up, and there's this kind of detritus of harmful effects that humans have had on the environment, which I guess relates to the whole Anthropocene concept, which I'd love to talk about more. And then in my current research with seed saving, what's really interesting with that is that rather than a lot of seed saving communities, which are very interested in sort of the kind of heirloom seeds and the heritage seeds, people in London seem to be much more interested in kind of creating conditions for what I've come to think of as abundant diversity. So it's really about having as many seeds as possible, almost, well, not almost, but kind of as an insurance policy for the future and for future generations of all kinds. And it's a sort of like, the more we have of the more different things, the better that is, which kind of sort of chimes with what you're saying about plastic in a funny sort of way, even though they're very different objects, which is kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's also interesting to me as you're talking about those two different things. I mean, it's fascinating that you've done this research on conceivable futures, and I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the other group.
Birth strike.
Yeah, birth strike. That's because those are definitely examples that I've I haven't delved into that much, but definitely kind of like run across and have been sort of fascinated with for precisely the reasons that you're talking about, right? It's like both on the one hand, in some sense, kind of an interesting proposition, especially I'm imagining, but correct me if I'm wrong, that most of the people involved in those movements are, white middle class people. And so it's sort of it's interesting, but you're totally right. It's also completely problematic in terms of the discourse and like not understanding that there's different positionalities and the kinds of the ways in which so many people, especially, even the sort of birth of the reproductive justice movement, or at least the ways in which it's talked about in North America, is very much connected to Black feminism and Black feminist struggles. So it's like, it's just a completely different set of concerns, right? It's like that the concern is not around whether or not one can reproduce. It's more like, what are the conditions of living, and like, like all of the conversations around infant mortality rates and women dying in childbirth and autonomy of one's own body, and all of these things, right? So but it's so interesting to me that, like, in the two examples that you're thinking about in terms of the seed saving and the conceivable futures and birth strike, it's like, it's the, like, on the one hand there's this kind of deficit model, and on the other hand there's this kind of abundance model, as you're talking about it. And it's also fascinating, like, I'm curious, with the seed savers, is it sort of like the vault system, or is it that people have to propagate the seeds like all the time in order to keep it going? Like, is it actually kind of like trying to, like, is it sort of an ongoing caring for a kind of much wider ecosystem?
Yeah, so it's kind of grassroots groups and individuals. So it's quite different from the kind of seed banking and the more formalised things like the Svalbard Seed Vault and the Millennium Seed Bank and those organisations. It's really people saving seeds in their own growing spaces, whatever those might be, because of course that's quite diverse in London and often quite limited, being a very expensive city. So it's people saving seeds and then sharing them with others, and there's a few sort of nodes within the city, with various levels of formality. So there's an organisation called London Freedom Seed Bank, which I've worked with a lot. There's a new seed saving network, and then there are community gardens and other kind of similar groups which are just providing the kind of very informal infrastructures for people to swap and share and save seeds themselves. And then one of the things that London Freedom Seed Bank does, as well as being a sort of a kind of temporary repository for seeds, because seeds come in and then they go out to other people, is they've set up this digital database of seeds. So that's very much about sharing knowledge about seeds and seed saving as well, which they see as, at least as important as saving the seeds themselves. But the seeds that they save are also saying something very interesting about what it means to live in London, to be in London, the conditions of London, because they tend to talk about those seeds that do well in London's conditions, where you have limited space, there's high density of buildings, so there's maybe limited light, tends to be very dry, and without wishing to fall into a stereotype about a British person talking about weather, it's very changeable, you never know what's going to happen. So there's all of those kinds of things, but also thinking about patterns of migration and the different reasons people might want to save seeds. So flavour obviously, but also having links with home, wherever home might be Yorkshire, might be Turkey, so I think that's part of it as well. It's about a kind of very celebratory model of human diversity and linking that with biodiversity. So yeah, it's very interesting, the contrast with, as you say, the deficit kind of ideas that are going on with the other groups. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's also interesting to me as you were saying this, that like, but like one of the connecting features between those two examples is that they're both rest and are kind of fundamentally dependent upon an understanding that there is no discrete individual, right? That the reason why one would choose not to have children in relationship to climate change is because of the environmental conditions, right? And also, like, if you're saving seeds and propagating them, you're actually also cultivating those the environmental conditions under which the seeds can actually grow. And so it is interesting in the sense that, yeah, they've arrived at sort of two different understandings of how to respond to that, I guess. But that there's somehow a kind of basic premise, which is this kind of fundamental understanding of how we're so deeply interconnected with our immediate environment. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I suppose it speaks to what some people have argued about how, you know, that human population numbers are important because of a sort of, you know, to take Donna Haraway as an example, arguing that, you know, if we really care about other species, we need to look at human population numbers, which I personally don't agree with. But I think she's raising an important point about human exceptionalism, and, you know, who, again, this question of who and what you're valuing, and what you're sort of making room for. It's for me, it's too dangerous a path to go down to get into questions of sort of curbing population growth and population control. And I also think that, you know, there are reasons enough within the reproductive justice framework to enable people to, you know, make what choices they can in terms of reproduction without having to link it to environmental conditions. To me, the reasoning breaks down. But yeah, so I do think there is that kind of thread there as well with how we think about other species in a funny sort of way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think even Haraway herself is kind of retracted or moved away from some of those things. I often think about you must know that beautiful little Making Kin population book. You know, I think that's like her response to all the criticisms that she was getting in relationship to precisely what you're bringing up as, like, you know, the population discourse is a very it's very difficult to enter into that discourse without it immediately going in all kinds of really kind of horrible ways.
Yeah.
So yeah,
It definitely is.
yeah.
I'd be really interested to talk more about the Anthropocene concept, which I know you've written about and thought about a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think that myself, like so many other people who write and think about the Anthropocene, have extremely mixed feelings about it. Maybe mine tend towards more of the negative rather than the positive. I do think that it was a useful term. I mean, I think that it's useful to have a term that kind of can encapsulate so many of the things that are happening right now, right? So, you know, we have climate change, or we have ecosystem collapse, or we have species extinctions, or we have, you know, various kinds of effects of extraction. But the Anthropocene, as far as I understand, is the only term that collects all of those things together so that you can talk about them simultaneously as interconnected phenomenon, not just as kind of a series of different things. So I do think that there's something useful in being able to have that kind of a term. You know, I think for me, like a lot of humanities scholars, it's the term itself sort of seems to betray itself in its own terminology, right? So it's like, and the fact that, I don't know if you've noticed this, or I don't know if it's maybe as prevalent in the UK, but it's so weird here in the last like maybe 15 years or so, 10, 15 years, all of a sudden people are using the word man again to talk about humanity. It's like, on the cover of Nature, like I just read a quote from Fred Moten where he does this. It's like, it's really prevalent. And it's like, and I just was like, I don't know what happened. Because it's like, all of these years of like feminist and critical race interventions into saying like, we cannot use the word man to talk about humanity. It seems to have just kind of like disappeared. And I personally really see this as connected to this rise of the Anthropocene discourse. Certainly within that discourse, there's a lot of that, precisely that language. And to me, sort of like in the best phenomenon of it would be like, oh, it's betraying itself in its own terms. Like the Anthropocene is not actually talking about everybody. It's only talking about the people who only ever were considered man, right? The people who only ever were considered fully human. Those are the people who this era is for and named after. But I feel like that's probably not what Kretzen and Stormer were thinking when they named that term. But it really does feel a little bit like it just kind of this thing that sort of reveals itself in its own naming. And because I knew that it was sort of like an important concept, it had all this traction in the kind of media and the art world. With a colleague of mine, Zoe Todd, we did try to intervene to try to convince the Anthropocene working group to date the Anthropocene from the 1610 marker, which was what Lewis and Maslin had put forward. Because at least if we were to think about it in those terms, we could think about the intersections of colonialism with what we now with how the world is now. And to me, that's a much more useful starting place, because it then allows us to really address those histories and address those really kind of violent ideologies that have really led to this kind of massive cases of extraction, both human and non-human, that we now find ourselves in, and all of the kind of ramifications of that. So we circulated that paper to them, and they were like, "Thanks for your, thanks for your input." And we can see you're very passionate about this. Is what I think they said. and we're like, okay, thanks. But yeah, obviously they settled on the 1950s date. I guess it's not totally official yet, but that's definitely seems to be the way that it's going. Which, I suppose if I was a geologist, it's a much more robust date in terms of the geologic record. But as somebody who isn't a geologist and who is much more concerned about what do these types of things mean in terms of how we orient ourselves, right? So like, if you pose a question in a particular way, then obviously, or if you frame a question a particular way, then obviously you have different responses to it. And so if we frame it in relationship to the 1950s, that's maybe kind of useful for thinking through questions of like the Cold War or militarization, or the massive use of petrochemicals. But I think for me, it kind of skips over some of the kind of questions about, well, why did we end up with these things, right? It's just it almost appears as if it's naturalized, or there's just like a specific set of problems that come from companies, rather than having to look a little deeper about some of our fundamental relationships. Yeah, do you have done any of the intervened in any of the Anthropocene things, or what's your interest in it?
I haven't been so bold or so passionate as to make the kind of intervention you have, but I have taught on this topic in the last few years, including your and Zoe's article, and I guess that's a form of intervention because students, you know, are very responsive to it, I find, and some of the other critiques as well, and I, you know, because I think it's a really good demonstration, you know, whatever the outcome was in terms of showing what humanities and social science scholarship can do, you know, in the world, because it's about, you know, what might seem like kind of nitpicking questions, but are actually really fundamentally important questions because it's getting to, you know, the assumptions at the heart of concepts which are then being put forward to describe, as you say, like really massive and important and significant phenomena which affect us all. And that's the point, you know. So you kind of do need to be careful about what you're saying because, as you suggest, you know, like when you say, well, you know, it makes sense if you're a geologist, but I mean, I guess this makes me think of Catherine Yusuf's work, you know, well, but where did they get to that being what makes sense, you know, as a geologist? Why is that important? Again, it's questions of value and, you know, what's considered to be important, what questions and what assumptions and, you know, what needs to be examined and what goes unexamined. And I think, again, for me, that's a really important part of, you know, taking inspiration from queer studies as well. It's that kind of, well, are you sure, you know, is that really how you're going to approach this kind of sort of almost kind of mode of being? And I think it's great the way that there has been quite a kind of explosion of feminist and decolonial critiques of this Anthropocene concept. And I think it does reflect the fact that it's one that has traction and it has, you know, it's gaining in its kind of hold on the imagination. You know, and as you suggest, the kind of positive side of that is that then you do have new terms to kind of move the discussion forward and you're bringing more people along, and, you know, obviously there are conversations that need to be had about responsibility. I mean, of course, the problem is, does this concept really lay responsibility in the right place? And of course, you know, other people have put forward alternative terms like the capitalocene and plantationocene and so on. And I suppose then that raises the question of, you know, is it just one scene? Is it helpful to think of one scene? Which again is, you know, a question that wouldn't make sense to a geologist perhaps. But, you know, I think is still really important, and that's the kind of valuable interventions that people outside of the kind of traditional sciences can make. And you mentioned art as well, and I guess that's because it is also about, you know, what's happening in public conversations, where most people aren't necessarily going to be using particular scientific methodologies either. And it's, yeah, it's about the term, literally about the terms of the debate. I guess it's also sort of raises questions about, you know, the kind of key figures in the debate, and sort of going back to some of the things we've just talked about. I know when I was reading your work the other day, I kept thinking about David Attenborough. Well, as a sort of, it's this sort of weird hinge between our work in some ways, because of, as you probably know, he's very into populationist arguments and is quite strongly involved in arguing for reducing human population or population growth as a way to kind of mitigate the effects of climate change and biodiversity loss. And he's also, you know, in many ways seen as the sort of hero of the anti-plastics movement, and more broadly, you know, I mean, he's obviously a national treasure here. It's like the epitome of a national treasure, but is seen as being, you know, kind of, for some compromised and for some kind of heroic in the way that he's shifted from being very quiet about climate change to starting to talk about it all the time and using his platform to do that. So yeah, I mean, I guess it just points to sort of broader questions again about, you know, who's in the conversation and how they use that platform.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm curious, like in your work, when you're thinking through these kinds of questions of like population and reproductive justice, you said earlier, like, you know, you try to be very conscious about how you position yourself, and to not appropriate, and you know, all of those kinds of things. How do you think through those questions, especially, you know, as a kind of reproductive justice scholar who is coming out of this kind of lineage?
Do you mean sort of how would I kind of think about population and the kind of discourses around that?
Well, yeah, maybe that's a more interesting question. I was actually more interested. I was actually just curious about like, how do you, like when you're teaching or when you're writing, sort of how do you address your own subject position in relationship to the kinds of conversations that you're entering into, which obviously have to do with population as well, and this kind of populationist, how do you say it? Discourses, yeah.
I mean, I guess the answers to that are very strongly connected, so maybe I can answer them both. I mean, I think I definitely, when I first started thinking about these things, I was aware of the kind of history of eugenics and population control, but didn't know as much as and was, you know, wary of that whole area, but didn't know as much as I might have, and have, you know, since educated myself much more about reproductive justice, and kind of more of the details of those histories. And you know, I find Michelle Murphy's work really helpful in that, and linking it with economy, and which makes total sense when you're thinking about environment as well. And I think, you know, that shows us that there's no real way of getting people to have fewer children that doesn't at some point down the line end up you know, shading into some form of eugenics, and I think that is just fundamentally indefensible. And I'm not the sort of person who tends to be that kind of rigid about things, but this is something that I can't.
Yeah, yeah, there's limits.
You know, this is the hill I'm prepared to die on. And I think it's because of those histories. I think it's also really kind of more than problematic. It's just sort of really distasteful and misanthropic to equate children with carbon emissions. I think people often kind of overlook the fact that children are people too, you know, and there are all these kind of assumptions that are made about, oh, it will take these sets of practices which will produce this much carbon to raise a child, and then it gets very individualized and sort of naturalized as well. It becomes inevitable. But instead we could be thinking about, well, maybe you don't have to raise children in this way, which is, you know, part of what Donna Haraway is saying, and I completely am on board with that whole part of the argument. Yeah, and I think also, as I mentioned earlier, kind of smashing together the kind of carbon footprint environment kind of situation with people's reproductive so-called choices is just not necessary. I mean, I think it's like, it doesn't really make sense, but I don't think it's necessary, because I think you can make an very strong argument both for preventing further environmental destruction and for facilitating people to have children or not, and in healthy environments in their own terms, just in terms of, you know, equity and autonomy and justice. So And again, it's a sort of question of like, you know, uncomfortable bedfellows. So there's so many examples of, you know, feminist and reproductive rights people who have got into the kind of populationist bandwagon, and then, you know, what are the unintended consequences of that? But in terms of my own sort of positionality, I mean, I guess I come at this, yeah, as you know, someone with a fair amount of privilege, and, you know, totally recognising that. But, you know, I also do come from queer PIV, both personally and in terms of my intellectual interests. And so I think that kind of helps, just as I said earlier, to just kind of be like, well, you know, what are the assumptions that are being made here? And I think that's, you know, as queer studies show, that's really important, particularly with reproduction, because it does get constantly sort of stuck onto this, you know, this is the future, this is how things are, this is what's normal, this is what's natural. And I find that really fascinating, but also quite depressing. So that's, yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I'm coming from, which sort of hopefully answers both of those questions to some extent.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah, it's just, I was just curious because it's definitely something that I think about in terms of my work, is like, how do you sort of navigate some of this terrain when it's not just a matter of sort of critiquing the outside, right? It's like also so much of what we're also bringing, right, to our questions. Yeah.